Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm glad that you're with me today, and I really appreciate you listening to this episode of the podcast. And as always, I pray that it will be a blessing and an encouragement to you on your journey of purity. And this episode happens to be part 8 of a series of episodes I started some weeks ago that I entitled 10 Things That Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. And I believe that this episode, part 8, will be the last episode of this series. And if you were with me last time, you know that I made it about halfway through principle number 9 of these 10 principles that every man should know. And the 9th principle is this: your wife wants you to know she needs emotional connection with you to be sexually present to you. And as I talked about that principle in our last episode, I was talking about how this idea might actually be kind of bad news for a lot of men, because the fact is that emotional connection is not something that a lot of us guys are necessarily good at. And I was sharing how there's both natural reasons and cultural reasons that make it hard for men to connect on an emotional level sometimes. And those cultural reasons have something to do with the fact, for example, that we allow little girls to be emotional. We even encourage them to feel their emotions, to share their emotions and their feelings. We give them permission to cry, while we teach our young boys that they need to be tough and they need to be rough, and they shouldn't be pansies and they shouldn't be sissies, and they certainly shouldn't cry. So we kind of embed within these boys from a very young age a sense in which they deny or suppress their emotions. And then this reality follows them through their adolescence into young adulthood and then into their life and into their relationships, and specifically into their marriage when they get married. And therefore, it might be hard for a lot of men to connect with their wife on an emotional level. And that can be challenging because some guys listening to this might say to me, well, Tony, you're telling me that I need to be able to connect with my wife on an emotional level if she's going to be sexually present to me, but I'm not very good at this emotional connection thing. And therefore, when I left off in our last episode, I was getting ready to share 6 principles that I think would help men to learn to be more emotionally connected in the context of their relationships. And I just believe that this is something that a lot of us guys are going to have to work on if we're going to get better at it. And the first principle of those 6 principles is this: realize that you do have emotions. Just be aware of the fact, guys, that you do have emotions and that you are, in fact, an emotional creature. The second principle is to realize that other people have emotions. Do you believe this? Do you believe that your young children have emotions, that your friends have emotions, that the people at your job have emotions, that your wife is an emotional creature? We just need to realize that not only are we emotional creatures, but everybody is. Other people are. And therefore, that creates the possibility that we can connect with others on an emotional level. So we just need to be aware of the fact that the people around us are emotional creatures. The people we're in relationship with are emotional creatures, and we need to seek and be open to the possibility of trying to connect in the context of our relationships on an emotional level. And principle 3 is this: realize the importance of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, also known as EI, as defined by Wikipedia, is the capability of individuals to recognize their own emotions and those of others, to discern between different feelings and label them appropriately, to use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior, and to manage and or adjust emotions to adapt to environments or achieve one's goals. So emotional intelligence concerns our ability to be aware of our own emotions and the emotions of others, to be able to discern and read what's going on emotionally around us, and then to manage our life accordingly. And I'll just say, guys, that I think this concept of emotional intelligence is incredibly important. And in the way of metaphor, I just saw this picture in my mind's eye when I was thinking about this. And I pictured what a submarine does with its sonar signal as it's cruising along underwater. And of course, what this submarine is doing is it's sending out this pulsating signal, this sonar signal. And it helps the submarine to navigate what could otherwise be dangerous waters, because the sonar allows it to detect objects that are ahead or around it in the waters around the submarine, such as other vessels that could be dangerous. So what I think emotional intelligence is, you guys, is a kind of emotional and relational sonar where people are perpetually sending out these signals, even though they might not necessarily be consciously aware of the fact that they're doing so, but we're perpetually sending out these signals, or we have this kind of sensitivity where we can detect and identify the emotional wavelengths of the people around us, and we can therefore navigate our relationships accordingly in the same way the submarine can navigate the waters through which it's passing. And the fourth principle that will help men be more emotionally connected in their relationships is to realize that emotional connection is important in your relationships. And I would just ask, guys, do you see this and do you believe this? Do you believe it's important to connect with the people that you love, such as your family and friends, on an emotional level? For example, do you believe it's important for you to convey to your young children, if you have young children, that you love them, not just with your words, but also with heartfelt expressions of emotional and physical warmth and connection, such as touches and hugs and kisses and embraces, and things like letting them sit on your lap, or laughing with them, or wrestling with them, and doing different things with them, and caressing their hair, and tucking them in bed at night, and saying prayers with them? Or, in the way of another example, do you believe that your wife has feelings and emotions, and that it's important for you to have an awareness and a sensitivity to her feelings and emotions, and that it's important for you to relate to her and to connect with her on an emotional level, and that it's important for you to be present to her and for you to offer yourself to her on an emotional level? So do you believe that emotional connection is important in your relationships? And I hope you do. And I hope that you might be willing to work on this emotional connection in your relationships. That brings me to principle 5, which is this: practice emotional self-awareness. And in order to help you understand what I'm trying to say with this point, let me share an interchange that I had with a man recently. And I happened to be working with this couple, and one of the wife's primary complaints was that her husband was angry all the time. This is the way that she experienced him, perpetually angry, and she wants him to be less angry. And coincidentally, guys, I happen to believe that anger is one of the few emotions that most men are accustomed to feeling, and that they're comfortable feeling, and that they allow themselves to feel, because anger, in a sense, is an empowering emotion, and a man can feel anger and still feel like he's in control of himself and of the situation. So anger, in a way, is a safe feeling for men to feel. So what I suggested to this man was a kind of assignment or an exercise that I wanted him to practice. And I suggested that my suspicion was that there is almost always another feeling or emotion lurking underneath the surface of his anger. So I asked him to picture the metaphor of an iceberg. And you know how the tip of an iceberg sticks up above the waterline so you can see what's above the water. But there's always this much bigger part of the iceberg that lurks underneath the surface. So I suggested to this man that his anger is like the tip of the iceberg. It's out in the open, and it's always sticking up above the waterline, and it's therefore very easy to see, and it's easy for his wife to see. But I said, imagine that there's always another emotion or emotions with an S lurking down underneath your anger. It's the part of the iceberg that's underneath the water. And therefore, what I want you to practice is I want you to try to identify what those other feelings and emotions might be if you could look underneath the water and see what was there. And here's how I want you to try to do this. So imagine this. I want you to pretend like somehow we could do a surgery on your soul, or we could do a surgery on your brain. And imagine if we could somehow completely remove anger from your soul and from your life. So now, somehow, magically, you literally cannot feel anger anymore. Anger is gone from your life. You no longer have the capacity to feel angry. So therefore, the next time you find yourself in a situation where you would normally feel anger and respond with anger, I want you to try to identify what feeling or emotion you might be feeling at that moment. But since you can't feel anger anymore, I want you to see if you can figure out what other feeling you're really feeling underneath the surface of the waterline. And if you do that, and if you'll practice this, I think you might be surprised at the feelings and emotions that you might begin to identify that you're really feeling if you could just get your anger out of the way long enough to let you feel the other feelings that are underneath your anger. So maybe, for example, you're really feeling insecurity in this particular situation, but it's safer for you to cover your insecurity with your anger. Or maybe really it's fear that you're feeling, or maybe you're feeling sadness or a sense of loss, or maybe you're feeling self-contempt, or maybe you're feeling annoyed or anxious, or maybe you're feeling out of control. So the question is this: what feeling do you think you would be feeling if you were not allowed to feel anger in this situation? So again, guys, my fifth point here is to practice emotional self-awareness, which means you should practice the ability to know yourself and to know what's really going on the inside of you, and to know what you're really feeling on the inside of you. And that brings me to my sixth and final point on how to develop deeper emotional connections in your relationships, which is point number 6, practice offering yourself to others on an emotional level. And I'd just suggest here, guys, that I think that this is going to be like anything else in life, that when you first try to do it, you might not be very good at it. When kids first try to learn to ride a bike, they're not good at it. They've got to practice. But the more you practice something, typically the better you get at it and the better you're able to do it. So maybe we're not good at this emotional connection thing, guys, but if we'd be willing to start where we're at and to practice this skill and to allow ourselves permission to try to begin to identify our emotions and our feelings and try to offer ourselves and connect with our wife on that level, that if we're willing to practice that it's like a muscle, and like any other muscle, the more you work it, the stronger it's going to get, and the better you can get at actually being present to your wife emotionally and connecting with your wife on an emotional level. And guys, I might be wrong here, but I don't think this needs to be as hard as we seem to make it sometimes. And I think that maybe it could be easier than we might think to begin relating to others on an emotional level. And I'm not exactly sure, guys, but if I'm a betting man, I'd bet that our wives will deeply appreciate any effort that we're willing to make on developing our emotional intelligence and therefore developing our emotional connection with our wives. And let me just remind you that the 9th principle of the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex, the 9th principle that we're talking about is your wife wants you to know that she needs emotional connection with you to be sexually present to you. And I just want to close this point, you guys, by reminding you that there's a definite advantage to learning to do this. Because if this principle is true, that the better our emotional connection is with our wives, that the better our sexual connection can be with our wives, then certainly we have something to gain by learning this skill. Because as we develop this deeper emotional connection with our wife, and we learn to be more present to her, more connected to her, more intimate with her, to share our heart with her, to relate to her and connect with her on an emotional level, that our wife is going to feel safer with us and be more present to us and be more intimate with us and respond in a deeper way to us. And therefore, I believe that it can lead to the most awesome, intimate, powerful, connected, beautiful sex that we've ever had with our wife. So guys, I just advocate that it's certainly worth the effort to invest in learning to stretch ourselves in this way and to practice and to learn and develop this ability to be more emotionally connected with our wife. And that brings me, therefore, guys, to the 10th principle of the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. This is our 10th and final principle, which is this: your wife wants to be romanced. And by the way, this is the other principle that my wife pointed out to me when we were talking about this. She said something like, let the guys know that they need to romance their wives, because women like romance and women respond to being romanced. And the more romantic the guys can be with their wives, the more their wives are going to respond to their husbands. So that is our 10th principle: your wife wants to be romanced. And by the way, you guys, I'd suggest that this point is really very complementary to several of the other principles that we've already covered. For example, Principle 1 said, your wife wants you to understand that healthy sex occurs within the context of a healthy relationship. So I'd suggest that if you're having a healthy relationship with your wife, that romance is already part of what's happening in that relationship, because romance is part of what it means to have a healthy relationship. And in the way of another example, Principle 7 said your wife wants to know that you're attracted to her and think she's desirable. So certainly, if you're being romantic with your wife and cultivating romance, it's going to send a message to her. It's going to convey to her that you like her, you're attracted to her, you think she's desirable, you want to be with her. So romance is going to affirm that seventh principle, and it's going to help your wife realize that you're attracted to her and that you find her desirable. And then Principle 8 said your wife wants you to understand that it takes her some time to get in the mood. So doesn't it make sense, you guys, that romance is going to help here? That if we can be romantic with our wives, that it's going to cultivate a kind of environment that will help our wife be able to get in the mood because she's experiencing this romantic initiative from us. And then Principle 9 said, your wife wants you to know she needs emotional connection with you to be sexually present to you. So again, guys, it just makes sense to me that if we're trying to create a romantic environment with our wife, we're trying to perpetrate romance in our relationship, that this romance is going to create a kind of emotional connection with our wife, that she's going to appreciate these romantic initiatives and she's going to respond to this. And therefore, there's going to be more of a sense of emotional connection that's happening between you and your wife. And Principle 9 says that as this emotional connection is established, that it's going to be easier for your wife to be sexually present to you. So romance certainly is an important part of this emotional connection. So the bottom line here, you guys, is simply this. Your wife wants to be romanced, and chances are that the more romanced she is, the more open and responsive she'll be sexually. And so I want to share with you guys 3 points or 3 observations about romance. And the first one is this. An enemy of romance is complacency. An enemy of romance is taking your wife for granted, familiarity, and neglect. And in the way of example, I thought of this metaphor. What would happen if you became complacent and began to neglect your car or your house? Things would move toward disrepair and brokenness, right? Therefore, we learn an important principle, guys, which is that maintenance is important. So if you're smart, you take care of your car, right? You maintain your car. So you're going to change the oil in your car every 3,000 miles. You're going to check the air pressure in your tires. You're going to check the brake fluid. You're going to take your car in the shop when it needs to go in the shop for maintenance needs, because you know the better you take care of your car, the better your car is going to take care of you, and the longer your car is going to last. And the same principle is just as true when it comes to taking care of and maintaining your house. Because the better you take care of your house, the better your house is going to take care of you, and the longer your house is going to last. So guys, I'd simply advocate that romance is a powerful way to maintain your relationship with your wife. It's an investment in your marriage, and the better you take care of your relationship, the better your relationship is going to take care of you. And that brings me to my second observation about romance, which is this. Treat your wife the way you treated her when you were dating her and pursuing her. Or said another way, treat your wife like your girlfriend. Put forth the same effort toward impressing and romancing your wife that you did when your love was new. Treat her the way you treated her when you were first dating her and pursuing her. Display your appreciation, admiration, adoration, and your love for your wife on a regular basis. Or said another way, make your wife feel like the most important person in the world to you, because she should be the most important person in the world to you, which means that you should date her and write her love letters and love notes and bring her surprises like flowers and chocolate and her favorite ice cream, and light candles and open a bottle of wine and give her a foot rub and make her a bubble bath and do things sometimes to show her that you're thinking about her, like sending her a text during the day to ask her how her day is going, or to tell her how much you love her, or to tell her how much you miss her, or to tell her that you can't wait to see her when you get home, and maybe make her favorite dinner, and maybe take her out to her favorite restaurant, and do everything and anything else that you can possibly think of to pursue your wife and date your wife and make your wife feel special and make her feel loved and make her feel romanced. Because all these things are romantic, and your wife will deeply appreciate this, and she will respond to these kind of things. And in view of this particular point, guys, let me ask you a question. And I'd like you to just be as honest and as objective with yourself as you can possibly be. And I'd like you to even give yourself a grade. And the question is this: how does the way you romance and treat your wife now compare with the way that you romanced and treated your wife then, when she was your girlfriend, when you were first pursuing her and courting her, and when your love was new? And I think that's a pretty good question for us to ask. And that brings me to my third and final point about romance, and I think this is an important point, you guys, and it's this: romance doesn't have to be expensive, extravagant, or complicated. And in fact, it's more about knowing your wife, knowing what she likes, knowing what's important to her, and knowing something of her heart. And of course, romance can be expensive and extravagant or complicated, but it doesn't have to be. And more importantly, it can be any combination of actions, activities, events, or words that demonstrate your sincere thoughtfulness, appreciation, and affection for your wife. And in the way of example, guys, I Googled the phrase, "the most romantic thing my husband ever did for me." And of course, 1,000 different things came up, and I began to read these stories. And so many of them were really awesome and really cute. So I went ahead and just wrote several of these down, and I'm just going to share these examples of romance with you as I bring this 10th principle to a close. And these are what a number of different women said in response to the question, what was the most romantic thing that your husband ever did for you? One woman said, the time our daughter vomited after eating spaghetti, my husband picked her up, took her to the bathroom, gave her a bath, and then cleaned up the mess so I wouldn't have to deal with it. Another woman said, my husband was learning to bind books, so he made me a hand-bound book of poems that he had written for me. Another woman said, the time my husband arranged a nap date for me so I could take an unexpected nap in the middle of my typically hectic and crazy day. Here's what another woman said. It was the dead of winter and there was a huge blizzard. I was getting off work and dreading the chore of cleaning off all the snow that was piled up on my car. When I got to the parking lot, my car was the only one that was clean, and there was a note on the windshield from my husband. He stopped by and cleaned off my car so I wouldn't have to. It made me cry. And by the way, you guys, I was reviewing some of my notes here with my wife, and I was reading her these examples of romantic things that men did for their wives. And when I read her that little story, my wife responded by going, "Aw," which shows that it touched her heart, and she thought that was romantic, that man did that to clean the snow off of her car. And so I thought that was interesting to see my wife's response. Here's what another woman said. The most romantic thing my husband ever did was when I unexpectedly had to spend the night in the hospital, and that evening my husband had gone home, but then he came all the way back to the hospital and brought me my favorite blanket from home so I'd feel better. Another woman said, I notice that my husband doesn't stare at other women, and when a beautiful woman walks by, he makes it a point to turn his head away from her and to look at me, and he gives me a smile or a wink. And this makes me feel like the most beautiful woman alive. And here's what another woman said. This may not sound romantic on the front end, but it was to me. After suffering years of infertility, we finally conceived, only to later discover that it was a tubal pregnancy and I would need emergency surgery. In the surgery waiting room, my husband insisted on being with me, even though he was told he couldn't. He sat with me and held my hand and looked me straight in the eyes and said, I love you, and I promise that we're going to be okay. Infertility can make a woman feel like a failure, but I gained so much security knowing that God gave me this man who loved me no matter what. I think that's the most romantic thing a man can do for his wife. He gave me security. And I thought that this next one was really cute. She says that even after 18 years of marriage, my husband still comes to the front door and rings the doorbell to pick me up for our dates. I still feel giddy and excited when he does this. So I thought that was pretty awesome. And this is the last one that I'll share with you guys. She says, my husband and I have been together for almost 22 years. We were separated for 3 of those years, and during that time we individually turned our lives over to Christ. I used to learn for the typical romantic gestures, poetry, candy, flowers, and unexpected kisses. But now I can honestly say that the most romantic thing that my husband does for me is when I'm having a really bad day, he will put his arms around me and pray for me. It means more to me than I could ever express, and it's one of the most romantic things he does for me. And guys, if I had to choose a proof text for this particular point, the importance of a man romancing his wife, I thought of Proverbs chapter 5, verse 18 through 19, which says this, Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. And just think about what that word exhilaration means, you guys. It says, be exhilarated with your wife. Be exhilarated with her love. Be enraptured by her. And I just think it speaks of the idea of us deeply appreciating our wives and then going out of our way to demonstrate how much we love her, how much we appreciate her, how blessed we are because she's our wife, that we're exhilarated by her, we're grateful to have this relationship with her, and that we are going to go above and beyond the call of duty to be romantic with her because that's what she longs for and that's what she deserves. And as this 10th point states, your wife wants to be romanced. And guys, with that being said, it brings us to the conclusion of the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. And this has been quite a journey that we've been on through this particular series over the past 8 podcast episodes. So let me conclude by just reviewing the 10 principles quickly. Principle 1 was this: your wife wants you to understand that healthy sex occurs within the context of a healthy relationship. Principle 2, your wife wants to know that she's the focus of your sexual exclusivity. Principle 3, your wife wants to know that during sex, you want her more than you want the sex itself. Principle 4, your wife wants you to understand that her sexual rhythm and appetite might be very different than yours. Principle 5, your wife does not want to feel like every time you touch her or kiss her, it has to lead to sex. Principle 6, your wife wants you to learn and utilize what she likes during sex. Principle 7, your wife wants to know that you're attracted to her and think she's desirable. Principle 8, your wife wants you to understand that it takes her some time to get in the mood. Principle 9, your wife wants you to know she needs emotional connection with you to be sexually present to you. And Principle 10, your wife wants to be romanced. And guys, those are the 10 things that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. And as I shared with you guys in the very first episode of this 8-part series, in the very near future, I'm going to be doing this complimentary series, 12 things that every woman should know about her husband when it comes to sex. That'll be the other side of the coin. And I mentioned that I had 10 things for this series and 12 things for the other series. So again, I just want to invite your feedback and your input. If you have any thoughts, any comments, any observations, or suggestions or objections, if you can think of a principle that should be on this list, something that I was not smart enough to think of, that is something indeed that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex, but I didn't include it on my list of 10 things, then I'd love to hear from you. And if I get enough feedback, I'd love to do a follow-up podcast episode where I share with you the different comments and feedback that I receive. But I really appreciate you being with me on this journey through this 8-part series that I entitled 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. I hope that it was encouraging. I hope that it was helpful. I hope it gives you some insight, maybe some understanding. Maybe it just brings to remembrance some things that you already know, and I pray that it might encourage you and exhort you to maybe engage some of these principles and practice some of these things and employ some of these things in your relationship with your wife. And with that being said, you guys, I know that I'm way overdue for this particular episode, but I wanted to finish up this series, so please forgive me for these extra few minutes that I've taken, but I do pray that it's been worth it and that it's been a blessing to you. And I really thank you guys for being with me here on the Power of Purity podcast. I invite you to come back next week where we will continue in our next episode, and I'll really look forward to that. God bless you. In the meantime, have an awesome week, have an awesome day, and I'll see you then.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.